Good morning, everyone. This is Cassidy Ellis, Local Governments Program Manager for SPEAR, South Central Partnership for Energy Efficiency as a Resource. Welcome to our monthly webinar for the City Efficiency Leadership Council. Really looking forward to our conversation today with Deb Taylor around PACE for local governments. So we will jump in with a couple usual announcements at the front. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the ELC, the City Efficiency Leadership Council is a program sponsored by the State Energy Conservation Office and co-partnered with the Houston Advanced Research Center, HARC. And we are a collaborative of public entities within Texas who are working around the adoption of energy management best practices in the public sector. We do that through now virtual regional roundtable luncheons, webinars, development of outreach material and education material, and direct support to public entities working on energy management projects and other energy, water, and resource-related work. If you're interested in getting involved, contact me directly. My contact information will be shared with attendees after this webinar. We do focus our work with the public sector, but things like our webinars are open to anyone. So glad to see a few familiar and new faces on the call. Few announcements for today. I can figure out how to progress my slide. There we go. CELC has a couple events coming up. So next Thursday, a week from today, we will have our Gulf Coast Regional Roundtable from 9 to 11. We are actually, based on the success of our Central Texas Roundtable last week, opening that roundtable up to other statewide public entities, creating a little bit more of a statewide conversation. So if you're with a public entity and interested in joining, you don't have to be on the Gulf Coast region. That is a public sector oriented meeting, so keep that in mind. And then our next webinar in our monthly webinar series will be on greenhouse gas inventory basics on May 21st. And we'll be joined by Kevin Mirsky with the City of Austin Office of Sustainability for that. So looking forward to that one as well. Our friends and partners at the North Central Texas Council of Governments is hosting a webinar on May 12th. Our speaker today, Deb, is also involved in that, but it should be a really great lineup, so consider attending. SPEAR's annual conference is currently still planning. We are still planning on holding it in person in September in San Antonio. Local governments, public entities are free to attend, so encourage you to consider it, although of course any travel and in-person events are come with an asterisk at this point. As many of you know, I will produce continuing education unit certificates, but again, keep in mind these are not affiliated with a specific certification. It is just for documentation for any self-reported hours that you may have for a certification that you carry. Okay, so with that, go ahead and jump into our presentation today. So I'm gonna let Deb tell you a little bit more about himself, but many of you on the call are probably very familiar with Deb Taylor. He was the longtime director of the State Energy Conservation Office and has been a friend and associate of SPEAR for many years, and a booster for energy and energy management best practices for quite a while. He is now the Chief Operating Officer of Texas PACE Authority, and is just an expert in all things Texas energy, so we're really glad to have Deb today. So with that, I'll let Deb go ahead and take over the slide share. And there you go, Deb. There you go. We've got your screen.
Great. Thanks, Cassidy. And audio is okay?
Yep, sound great.
All right. Good.
Oh, actually, sorry, before you get started, For anyone, as we're going along, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please put in questions as we go, and it actually looks like the chat function may be active as well. So communicate through that Q&A as we go along, and then I think we'll have some time for question and answer at the end. Sorry, Deb, go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the nice introduction, and yeah, glad to be with everyone this morning virtually. We're going to cover this morning kind of a deeper dive on PACE for local governments. Cassidy shared with me the registration list before the webinar, and I see from that there's probably about a third of the people who are really familiar with this, and so this may be a refresher. It may reinforce some things you already know. It may answer some questions you have, but so about a third seem pretty experienced, about a third to kind of look in the middle, and then there's about a third that names that I was not familiar with. And so this is a primer, sort of an overview of PACE for local governments, and it can be complicated. So it's one of these things where, you know, you hear it once, you absorb some, you hear it the second time, you get more, and then the third time is usually when you start to master it. So good overview today, and happy to follow up individually afterwards with anyone that has any further detailed questions. So with that, let's see. So my screen is now locked up. There we go. So this is me. As Cassidy mentioned, I ran the State Energy Conservation Office for 20 years. Before that, I was in the private sector, and in the commercial real estate area, had a company. We did property management, appraisal, and tax consulting, largely representing property owners that were buying distressed properties post S&L bust of the 80s. And so before I got into the public sector, I had experience managing that side. And so this opportunity to work with the Texas PACE Authority really marries the two sets of experience. On the public sector, we obviously did a lot of technical assistance, energy efficiency project implementation, project financing through the Lone Star program. And so this seemed to be a pretty natural fit, and it's been an exciting couple of months in spite of the COVID delays and setbacks. And I think there's just really an immense untapped opportunity for utilization of PACE throughout the state. So today what we're going to cover are these items. Going to go backwards a little bit and talk about what PACE is, how it works in Texas, some of the details of how it works administratively, and then conclude with case studies of actual projects in the state, a number of different sectors, discuss some resources for after this, and I think we should have time for Q&A at the end. So with that, let's look at the PACE overview of PACE. So what is PACE? And again, many of you may know this already, but PACE stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. And then what's really missing is financing, because that's what this is all about. It's a financing structure. As we say here, it's a simple way of paying for capital projects with no money out of pocket. So really it should be PACEF, but that's an awkward acronym, so we just call it PACE. And it provides, through PACE, you can get long-term 100% financing in Texas energy efficiency, water conservation, and distributed generation projects. Those are all allowed under state law. It is for C&I, so commercial, industrial properties, and multifamily. So that's 5 units or more. Apartment complexes, anything with 5 units or more is considered commercial. Some states have residential PACE, single family. We don't have that here. So here it's C&I. And the key to this all is it's repaid through a special assessment on the property that is matched to the useful life of the improvements. So it better aligns the benefits, the savings for the owner, with the debt service, with the financing. So that's really the key. And we're going to go into more of that in a minute. PACE in Texas, authorized in state law back in 2013. And that allows, our structure here allows local governments to then establish local PACE programs. And then most well, actually all, excuse me, local governments have opted not to administer this on their own to create PACE departments. And so in our case, Texas PACE Authority is a nonprofit that was established specifically to administer PACE programs throughout the state of Texas for local governments. And a key here is it's voluntary and it's open market. So that means that this is not a requirement, it's not a mandate, it's not a top-down thing. If a property owner decides that they have a project that makes sense for them to utilize PACE to implement, they can do that. There's no requirement they do that. It's not a regulation or anything else. And then open market, what that means is that we don't have a predetermined set of contractors, capital providers, engineers. Essentially, the program is sort of a conduit. So any qualified engineer can be involved in the projects. Any owner where a PACE district exists can utilize it. Any contractor can do the work, and any capital provider, assuming they meet certain financial qualifications, can provide the capital. And so typical with how we do things in Texas, very market oriented. Our structure here is open market. And it really is, you hear this, that a win-win-win, that gets overused, but I think in this case, it really is a good description. Property owners benefit. They get lower utility bills, lower operating costs, maybe improved indoor comfort. The value of the property increases over time because now you've restored mechanical systems. Contractors are involved in doing the work. The lenders have a very low risk loan, and the tax lien position assures that the default is very low. Communities, this is a way, if you have properties that may be existing properties that are vacant that need to be redeveloped, this can be used for that. Obviously, it is going to improve the overall value of the building stock from an appraisal standpoint over time when those properties change hands. So redevelopment, and then at a high level, this the benefits that accrue statewide. If we are improving the efficiency of end-use buildings and manufacturing facilities during those hottest days in August when everybody's air conditioning is running, the risk of brownouts and addressing peak demand issues can be addressed through PACE. Grid reliability, resiliency, distributed energy projects can be funded through PACE. So as Hurricane Harvey demonstrated, it's very important, and the businesses that had backup generation had the ability to sort of make it through those temporary disruptions in power supply. Really were of service to the community. And then improved air quality, and then water resource conservation, which really, water 10 years ago, everyone was talking about drought, and then it rained, and it rained again, and now the lakes are full, and there's no concern or no immediate concern about drought. Well, it's still there. We're Texas, and the reality is, we're in a constant state of drought that's interrupted by big rain cycles. So that's a good long-term benefit as well. So as I said, it creates local jobs, improves conservation, and bottom line, saves money for the owners that decide that this is a good match for their projects. And the two key barriers and reasons why efficiency projects don't move forward. Number one is technical and kind of informational. Maybe the owner doesn't know that they have a project opportunity. Maybe they do. Maybe they've seen that we think our utility bills are higher than they were 5 years ago. What's going on? So there's an investigative and technical side to better understand, okay, what those opportunities are. But then once they know, the question is, great, okay, this is going to cost money. I don't have money. If I had this sort of capital, I would have done it already. So PACE, the nature of PACE being long-term financing, again, that matches up the benefits with the debt service, is that means of clearing that financial hurdle to get these projects implemented. So it answers the question of how we're going to pay for it. And the types of things we're talking about here in Texas, again, it's energy or water usage reduction projects or on-site generation. And this is just an example of the types of things that could be eligible. HVAC, lighting, building controls, combustion burner upgrades in industrial settings, renewable DG systems, a lot on the water side, down to irrigation equipment. So these are examples. There's not a list of what is eligible and what's not. It's really reviewed from an engineering standpoint on a case-by-case basis, but this illustrates the types of things that can be improved. So essentially anything that's sort of in the mechanical, electrical, plumbing realm, including on-site generation, is potentially something that could be in a PACE project. And so back to the financials and why this is uniquely different. If you look at the need, and say you're a commercial property owner, and you know that you need equipment replaced, maybe it's at the end of its life, it has high maintenance costs, or maybe it's inefficient and needs to be replaced. There's a couple of options. If you have cash in your budget, pay for it, and there's that means the cash is something that's not available for other things, so you may not want to do that. So you go to your bank and you say, I need an equipment loan to replace this equipment, this aging equipment. They say, great. Your terms are 60 months, and your interest rates are going to be 10% because this is an unsecured loan. We're not going to go pull the equipment out of your building if you default. So our risk is greater. So we're going to reflect that through the cost of money we're going to lend you. And also we're going to minimize our risk by saying the payback term is maybe, up to 5 years. So the problem that creates with conventional financing is that for the first, several years after the project is completed, you have this very high repayment component. And so you're upside down financially, your net operating income, you're negative there. So you have the repayment. Once that repayment is completed, okay, now 100% of those utility savings accrue, but there's a delay. So you're cash flow negative on the project for a period of time. With PACE, because again, it stretches the repayment over a longer term and has a lower interest rate, what happens is you're cash flow positive day one. So the deals are structured in a way that the financing is going to equal to or be less than the savings, and you begin again accruing those savings on day one. So it's a means of again generating cash flow and increasing net operating income right away from these projects. Some of the investment barriers that are out there that PACE helps overcome. Again, no upfront capital is needed. Funding over a long term, as long as 20 years. Plus, depending on the measures, it's 100% financing. It's not based on credit worthiness necessarily of the borrower. It's tied to the property, so 100% financing. Because this becomes an assessment, it becomes an operating cost on the property, which means in a lease situation, operating costs typically in a lease can be passed directly through the tenants. So this helps address the split incentive challenge with multifamily, malls, things like that, where you have tenants involved in commercial space. Then also, one of the keys here is that because the assessment stays with the land, if the owner of the property sells the property after 3 years, they get 3 years of benefit from the project. They pay for 3 years of the cost, and then that transfers to the next owner. And it can be paid off early. Sometimes a lender will have provisions for payoff. There might be a prepayment penalty that can be negotiated at the front end. But in most cases, the benefit here of the long-term nature of PACE is that it does transfer automatically, just like a tax assessment. This is not a tax, but it's like a tax assessment to the next owner, and they pay the next increment, and again get the corresponding benefits. If you look at PACE, the PACE alternative compared to a couple of others, and this is an example that demonstrates how again you can realize immediate cash flow. So this project, this illustration of $1.1 million efficiency upgrade, projected savings of $125,000 a year. And if you focus on the graph, there's three things here. Three examples, three means of implementation. Number one, the self-funded option, which is a yellow line. So you go 1.1 negative right away in cash, because now that cash is unavailable for other things. And in about year 8, you begin to hit your break-even point. So for 8 years, essentially, your cash flow negative. In a finance situation, you're going to have a down payment. Typically, you're going to have a period of repayment for that loan, and so you go negative for a period of time before you begin to bend the curve back up. And in that scenario, it shows cash flow positive about year 9. With PACE, again, it's because it's 100% financing and it's longer term at a lower interest, your cash flow positive from day 1. That's the blue bar. So net operating income impact there of about positive $30,000 a year, and that's why this is really, I think, an appealing financing alternatives to other approaches that are out there. Another illustration, and this is a little bit different. This is a actual project in Dallas where there was an abandoned warehouse. A developer came in and said, we want to take this abandoned property that's sort of an eyesore, hasn't been used for much over the years, and we want to redevelop it into loft condos, apartments, and then part of the building is actually a hotel. And taking a building shell and converting it that way is an expensive proposition. So their capital stack, and this is pretty typical for a project like this, the before scenario, they were expecting for it to be about a $116 million project. And if you look at how the capital stack is typically arranged, the senior debt there about 50 million, tax credits about 22, equity 22.4, and then the mezzanine loan, that's really sort of the short-term gap filling. So once you've assembled all the other longer-term, more secure debt components, then you have to fill the gap with this mezzanine loan, and that's usually very expensive. In this case, it was 15% interest, which is very high. So what they did is they basically swapped, and they said, a lot of the work we have to do with this project is MEP. It's efficiency, it's water, it's building envelope, it's a lot of these different things. And so they secured a PACE loan and were able to actually do a little bit more. PACE loan for $24 million, increase the total project to 118, and then by factoring in the lower cost PACE loan, their weighted average cost of capital came down 20%. So on a project that's $118 million, that really gets investors' attention. And this is another way on sort of a larger redevelopment approach that PACE can be integrated. So that's the overview. And so in Texas, here's where we are right now. As far as projects that have been completed, most of these have been in the commercial and retail space, 30%, hotel, hospitality, 20%, commercial office, 17 nonprofit, and then really, I think, some untapped market segments, multifamily, that's a big one, and then industrial. We use more energy in the industrial space in Texas than any other sector, and that's eligible for PACE. We just haven't really done that many projects, so that's a big untapped opportunity. If you look at how the projects break down, just over half are energy efficiency related, about a third are water conservation related, and then 12% distributed generation. So mostly efficiency, mostly energy efficiency, but some of each. And then the bar graph shows how PACE projects have evolved over the last several years. I mentioned that state law enabled PACE back in 2013. It took a little while to ramp things up, to develop guidelines, to develop standards, to help owners understand this, and also to create the local PACE programs to move things forward. So it was a slow ramp up. 2016, we saw some deals. 2017, it grew. Pointing out 2019, there really is, I think, that's an inflection point. We started to see a whole lot more understanding, acceptance by owners, more PACE programs available locally. And in 2019, we saw as many transactions that one just last year as had been done in all the previous years. So it's a big year. 2020, if you look real close, at the very top of the blue, there's green. And we have had we've closed 3 projects in 2020. This is prior to COVID, and we're expecting 2020 to be a big year. We think it still will be a big year, a successful year, but like everything else, things are delayed a bit, or at least there's some challenges related to COVID. We are seeing some different types of projects come through the pipeline. Those projects that were financially sound and probably had owners had a very long-term view, those are moving forward. There is a bit of a delay, but those are still in the pipeline and we expect will happen. But also we've seen some refinancing opportunities. There's a look back provision. So if a project was completed recently, and there was clear intent that can be documented for that project to have energy efficiency, water efficiency benefits, then it's possible to go back and do a partial refinancing through PACE for some of those measures that have already been completed. So we're seeing projects like that approach us as well. So that's I think that's more of a short-term thing, but I think the prospects overall are still very strong. And the market here and the footprint is growing. We've done over $100 million of projects to date, and about 60% of the state's population is now covered through local PACE programs and districts. 27 counties, 19 cities, and some of these are new this year. So the Burnett County, northwest of Austin, is new this year. City of Abilene is new this year, and just recently, City of San Antonio is now on the list. And so, again, in spite of some of the challenges and the current market conditions, I think this being a long-term proposition, we're still seeing things move forward. So how does that work? How does a city or county become a PACE district? There is a process, and this is outlined in state law. And there's really sort of 3 phases, 6 steps in those 3 phases. The first one is that the public entity posts a report publicly on how the program will work. That allows the public and interested parties to comment or to take a look at how this all rolls out. Next, we see most cities and counties hold a sort of a public briefing and discussion. Oftentimes we are asked to come be part of that to answer specific questions. And then usually that's part of a hearing where they pass a resolution of intent, which is also a required step to establish the PACE program. Once that's done, in the resolution of intent, they also have to then say, we are going to hold a public hearing on such and such date specific, where we are going to consider a resolution to establish. And so that comes next. So there's a public hearing, second public hearing, or really the only required public hearing, but a second opportunity for the public to be part of this and engage. Then they pass a resolution to establish. And so that creates the program. And as I mentioned earlier, no local government has opted to create a PACE department. And so they also then select an administrator to operate the program. And so the map I just showed you, those are the areas that we serve, the Texas PACE Authority. And the key to this all is after the PACE law was adopted, unlike many other laws where typically a law gets passed, it's very general in nature, and then usually a state agency is designated to develop rules that are more specific on how this law gets implemented. And then beyond that, beyond the rule, oftentimes there are guidelines that's kind of one layer of detail more. With PACE, it simply adopted and authorized this, but then there was no guidelines, no rules, no rulemaking. And into this void, a group of volunteers, hundreds actually, and with different areas of specialization, came together under the Keeping PACE in Texas banner and created a uniform set of guidelines and documents for PACE administration in the state, and we call that PACE in a box. So the advantage of this is without this uniform set of documents, potentially you could have, 254 different county programs. You could have, 1,200 different city programs, all operating a little bit differently and based on their interpretation of the PACE law. And that drives, capital providers and owners nuts because they don't want to do business 1,000 different ways. So by having PACE in a box, that provides a uniform set of guidelines and operating standards for use statewide so that they don't have to create that on their own. So Texas PACE Authority, we sort of sit in the middle. We work for local governments, administering their PACE programs. We work with property owners to shepherd their projects through the process. We are a resource for capital providers and then service providers as well. So contractors and engineers that are really integral to the whole process. So we sit in the middle and facilitate, but have no direct role in the project other than that. So how PACE works, and this is this is more general, sort of schematic, and then I'm going to go into more detail in a second. So typically a building owner, again, once they understand, hey, there's an opportunity worth pursuing, we think PACE could be a good fit. So they find a contractor to help them identify what that opportunity is. They select the projects that make sense. They look to figure out, who could finance this project, what capital provider may be interested, and then they apply to the PACE program. In between that first set of arrows and the bottom set of arrows, there's a lot of review, technical review, ensuring that the financing of the project is going to work, the savings will accrue, it meets various criteria. Then once we're through that phase, the owner signs a contract with the PACE program that is an agreement to place an assessment on the property in exchange, for the repayment. Capital provider steps up, provides the funding, commits the funding. The contractors complete the project, and then in Texas, our system is the owner sends the installment payments directly back to the lender. Now that's secured by an assessment, but it is not a line item on their property tax bill. That's different. Some states, they simply, what they'll do is they'll adjust the property tax bill and it becomes like a tax. We don't do that in Texas. It's the installment goes directly to the lender. This is the process map for what Texas PACE Authority does. And again, we shepherd the application through this entire process. As you can see, I won't read all these, but there's a number of checks and balances on the legal side, on the underwriting side, on the technical side. You'll see the term ITPR used here quite a bit. I'm going to go into that in a second. That's really the assurance that from a technical standpoint, the project is going to deliver. So this is the detail of the application process. A couple of key things in Texas, the loan to value ratio. So say you have a $1 million property. Our guidelines say that the PACE project itself can be no more than 20%. So $200,000, excuse me, on $1 million project. That's to, again, from a underwriting standpoint, ensure that you're not committing more from the PACE side than maybe the property is worth down the road. Another key thing here, savings to investment ratio has to be greater than 1. So that means over the average useful life of the project, that savings created by that project will at least meet that investment requirement, which seems to make perfect sense. But sometimes, again, on typical equipment, short-term financing, it is not greater than 1 because your payments are much greater on the front end. And then the other key thing in Texas is that because this becomes a senior lien, tax lien status on the property, if there's an existing mortgage, this PACE lien becomes superior to that existing mortgage. So if there is a mortgage, the mortgage holder has to provide consent. And that has not been a problem, but obviously if someone's going to jump you in line in terms of seniority, you need to know that, and you have to provide consent. A little bit deeper on the savings to investment ratio. This is a pretty simple calculation, but Again, total energy and water projected savings over the life of the project, and the investment's the total amount of the assessment. The example below here, HVAC and lighting, pretty simple math. Project cost $1 million, and that's all in. That's including financing, soft costs, everything else. And project savings projected fit 1.5 over a 20-year period. So in this case, it's an SIR of 1.5. It's greater than 1. This would qualify. So that's the basic math on the SIR. So how do you know, or how do you have confidence that those savings will actually materialize? Well, we have a detailed manual that sets out, how contractors and engineers do these assessments. This is not something that we created from scratch, from the ground up. Much of the thinking behind it mirrors what we've done with what we did with the Lone Star program, or are doing with the Lone Star program in SECO, the office that I was with for 20 years and left, retired just at the end of January. But they're based on standards that any qualified engineer, designer, architect should be familiar with. So, and then also we have, as a key check and balance, the independent third-party reviewer, which ensures that whoever did the initial analysis, the contractor, the owner, the owner's engineer, that the project should pay back as expected. That ITPR review, again, this is required by law. So this is an engineer, a Texas licensed PE, that's otherwise not affiliated with the project in any way. They need to not only be licensed, but have experience in doing energy and water projects. You saw the certifications, CEM, et cetera, that sort of thing, 5 years of experience doing these projects. And there's two parts. They do a before review, and that's looking at the baseline conditions, projections, and then a site visit to ensure that what's being represented in the project is actually what's there on the ground. And then the after, and this is a verification that once the project is complete, that everything was installed correctly and is operating as intended. And usually those are supported with site visit photos that become part of the file. The construction process and itself, so the contractor, that can be anyone, does the initial energy analysis. The ITPR reviews the savings. The project goes to the construction phase, and then the ITPR does the installation verification. Pretty straightforward there. So let's look at how this is actually played out in Texas with some case studies. And I've got several here. These are actually on the TPA website as well, projects that have come through various local PACE programs, but different categories. And again, when you think of C&I, commercial and industrial, most people think of, a tenant lease property, a mall, something like that, and that clearly is commercial. But in industrial, it could be manufacturing. In commercial, it can be hospitality, it can be retail, and also it can be nonprofit. So PACE cannot fund public projects. If you have a public project, city, county, school district, et cetera, go to Lone Star for that. That's a great source of financing. But if you're a nonprofit, even though if you're a nonprofit, you're not public. But you're not necessarily commercial, at least don't view yourself as commercial, but from a property appraisal standpoint, your property has an account with a local appraisal district. So you have the ability to finance through PACE, and that's the first one I'm going to talk about. At the outset, I mentioned that my background was both at SECO and then before that in the commercial sector. And when this opportunity came up to join Texas PACE Authority, I thought, well, this really makes sense, because this project, the Congregation Beth Israel, which is here in Austin and Travis County, where I'm sitting here in my home office, I can actually see this building. And this was the very first PACE project in the state of Texas. I actually taught my kids to ride bicycles in their parking lot. So this is like the planets aligning. So I'm happy to still be part of all this. And in this project, the different measures undertaken, they had temperature control issues. They have a huge glass west-facing wall which creates challenges. So they applied window film first to reduce heat gain from that. They needed to replace HVAC systems, which were aging and actually in their daycare center were compromising their ability to serve the kids there. They were having to open doors and windows, bring in fans, things like that. So they replaced HVAC and building controls as well. This project qualified for incentives through Austin Energy, which helped buy down the cost. Utility incentives are very important if they're available, because that's really considered owner's cash and can buy down the cost of the project to maybe help it clear those SIR thresholds we talked about. The assessment here, $452,000, resulting in 20% utility savings annually. And again, in a nonprofit, and particularly in a house of worship like this, cash flow is challenging because it's whatever members of the congregation are able to contribute on a weekly basis. You generally don't have a stockpile or a big savings account. So this is a very good solution for nonprofits. Another project, and this is the Elgin General Store. This is a single measure. So all they needed to do was they wanted to put rooftop PV, and they didn't have the cash to do that, but they saw the benefits, and they were able to secure a $31,000 grant from USDA from the REAP program, which is available to commercial properties as well as agricultural producers in rural areas. And rural is obviously Bastrop County, and Elgin, which is not as rural as you might think, qualifies. So that could be a good opportunity. Again, that's considered owner's cash contribution. They also were able to secure a $38,000 utility incentive through Encore, which is one of the state's investor-owned utilities. And then the total assessment wound up being $120,000, and that rooftop PV system is shaving 26% off of their electricity consumption annually. This building in Houston is a typical commercial property with multi-tenants. They had aging, 20, 25-year plus HVAC systems, and that needed replacement. There were maintenance headaches. There were indoor comfort issues, moisture control of the buildings in Houston. And so they were able to replace all of that, upgrade and put in a new building control system, LED lighting. The project qualified for a $30,000 incentive through CenterPoint. Again, utility incentives are key. Always look for them. And the assessment total here is a pretty big project, $1.3 million, but significant energy savings, utility savings, 30%, 38% annually. The next project, this is multifamily, and this is interesting in two ways. It's the first multifamily project done through PACE in Texas. It's also new construction. And so what they did here, Rockport, as you may know, was devastated by Hurricane Harvey. And it was pretty limited with multifamily to start with, but any sort of rental properties were pretty much flattened. And so service workers in the service community is living at Corpus and having to commute. And so there's a big need for multifamily. So a developer came in, had a property that was developed already, and said, we want to put a new apartment community on this property, but we want to go above code. We want it to be better than the minimum requirements. And so in this case, they have, above code lighting, plumbing fixtures, and then also in the building envelope, they have above code windows that reduce heat gain, which is key in Rockport if you're along the coast. Better wall insulation, better roof insulation. So here, PACE did not pay for the entire project, but it financed the incremental cost of the above code measures. So in a new construction facility like a situation like this, PACE can be brought in as well. And very significant, both electric and water savings just for the measures above code that PACE financed. On the manufacturing side, this is a project in Corsicana, Navarro County, just south of Dallas. This was an existing manufacturing facility that a company, the R.J. Levy company, which is a clothing company, they make like cheerleading uniforms, athletic uniforms, things like that. They needed to convert it from its usage the way it was used before to how Levy wanted to use it now. And so part of that involved new HVAC and lighting. And so those components were financed through PACE, $325,000, resulting in 30% annual savings. And this is a project too. This is a good example where the company came to the county and said, you know, we're buying this property. We need to make improvements. We want to use PACE for the MEP side. There wasn't yet a program in Navarro County, but because of this project, you know, that was motivation for the county to establish the project. So oftentimes, if you have an actual project out there versus just sort of speculating someone might use PACE, that can be the motivation that a commissioner's court or mayor or city council needs to move it forward. And from an economic development standpoint, you know, there are 75 jobs associated with this facility, which is very meaningful there in Corsicana. And finally, this is a pretty interesting project, a very interesting project in El Paso. The Plaza Hotel downtown, if you've been to El Paso, you probably have seen it. At the top, it says Plaza. Fallen into disrepair. This is a beautiful, you know, Art Deco 30s building, part of Conrad Hilton's expansion, and many towns in West Texas have these, you know, unbelievably, you know, beautiful, but oftentimes abandoned and dilapidated hotels in their downtown areas. This is one. So the investors that bought the Plaza Hotel said, we need to renovate it, obviously. This is a top to bottom renovation, a big project. But part of that is MEP, so HVAC and lighting, elevator motors, building envelope, and then plumbing. They were able to secure historic tax credits on the incentive side. In this case, the PACE components were $9.2 million and very significant savings. So again, this is where PACE plays a role in an overall redevelopment of a property. So again, PACE is a win-win-win. All these property owners, contractors, lenders, communities, and the state all benefit. So some follow-on resources for you to take a look at. Everything I've covered today and the case studies and even more are available on our website, Texas PACE Authority, and Cassidy will distribute these slides later, and so you don't have to try to write down these kind of awkward hyperlinks, but you'll have these later. On our website, two things to pay particular attention to: our program guide and technical standards that I covered. That's sort of the how-to. They're all there. They're published. There's not a cost to access them, so that's provided. We also have a listing of different events and training. Like so many entities, and like we're doing today, we're moving more and more of our training to virtual, to web-based. Last Thursday, we had the first of our series of what we're calling our T5 trainings, and it's the Texas PACE Authority's third Thursday at 2. And so every third Thursday at 2 of the month, there will be a different training opportunity. Last week, we focused on the technical side for engineers and developers. The next one in May is going to be targeted more towards specialty capital providers. So we'll have a different topic every month. Those are all there. My former office, SECO, the State Energy Conservation Office, has information there all about PACE. At the national level, there is an organization called PACE Nation, and this is a trade organization that represents all the different entities involved in implementing PACE across the country. There's some pretty interesting sort of national data there that you can see. And I was on a webinar yesterday that I was surprised to see that I think Texas is 4th in terms of commercial PACE deals in the country, even though our program is pretty new. And I think of course, my objective is to see us first and have more of this throughout the state. But I was a little surprised. I thought we would be further down the list given our new more recent start. And then finally, the U.S. Department of Energy has a whole slew of information on PACE programs, both C&I, commercial and industrial, which we have in Texas, but then also quite a bit on residential as well. So good resources there. So with that, I will stop talking and see what questions we have. And Cassidy, how do you want to handle that?
Great. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, questions can be handled a few different ways. This is actually the first webinar where the chat box seems to be active. So attendees, feel free to type in the chat box or the question and answer box. If you want to try and speak, so Deb, I think we can see, I may go back to my shared screen just so we have just sort of a blank background.
All right.
If you want to raise your hand so that you can, well, sorry guys, actually speak out loud, go ahead, but it doesn't really work the best. So, but in the meantime, we did get a question come through in the chat box about distributed power projects, distributed generation. So you shared the Elgin General Store example as a renewables project, but the question is, would a natural gas distributed generation project be considered?
Yes, it's not PACE is not technology specific, so anything that's capable of delivering power essentially on the customer side of the meter could qualify. The key to a natural gas project would be, I guess, a couple of things. One, if it's like a micro turbine, you know, is it going to meet local emission standards that may be in effect? If the case is yes, from a permitting standpoint, then okay, you can move forward. The other is it primary power or is it backup, and how often is it going to run? Because you have to have you know, expected run hours to do your savings to investment ratio calculation. So if it's simply backup and it's used occasionally, it's probably not going to have enough run hours to displace grid power for you to do that calculation. But if it is like a micro turbine where it's running pretty steady state and it's always going to represent, say, 20% or 50% of your power needs, then certainly that's something that could be plugged in. So yeah, PACE is kind of is technology agnostic, so it could be rooftop solar, could be a natural gas distributed generation system on the customer side of the meter, but the key is it's got to be on the customer side of the meter.
Got it. Great. So you covered how a local government adopts a PACE district, but have you seen any best practices on how a local government can best encourage the business community to use and adopt PACE? Is that typically communicated to the development community?
So where it's been most successful, it's been done through or in conjunction with the local EDCs or chambers of commerce, typically where you have, you know, local businesses and building operators already engaged. This is a tool. This is one of many things that the EDC would want to promote. So usually that's a good forum. Yeah, so we've seen, again, good success when things have been done in conjunction with local economic development.
Great. And that's, I think, one of the best messages that I've heard in other PACE presentations is that it is an economic development opportunity. And I know that there are a number of counties and cities that have adopted it for that purpose, correct?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, ultimately, yeah, I was going to say, ultimately, you know, from a local elected official's perspective, you know, they may understand the technical side. They may have local priorities that you know are you know, revolve around sustainability, you know, reducing emissions, things like that, and they may be, you know, this may be a sort of perfect complement to achieve some of those objectives. In other cases, it may be that, you know, that's not on the radar at all for the local government, but helping to the extent they can, local businesses, be more competitive and help address indoor comfort issues, things like that. Again, increase the value of the property purely from a business standpoint. Those may be the drivers. So you have to, it can be different. It's going to be different in different places and different situations.
Great. And about what percentage of the Texas population is currently covered by a PACE district?
So by our calculation, about 60%. As I mentioned, we're operating in 46 different counties and cities. In some cases, like with a city, it's going to be generally the city boundaries and ETJ that's covered. And so any property within the city, if it's a city program, if it's a county program, it's anything in the county. So if you've got a county with multiple jurisdictions, city jurisdictions, any could qualify. So we've seen more county-wide programs than city programs, but either is an opportunity.
Great. I don't know if you could maybe share your screen again and show that map just for the visual reminder of where those adopted PACE districts are. It is quite widespread throughout the state, and the major population centers, I believe all the major population centers are included in districts currently. Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
I'll get there.
It's been really impressive to see how quickly Texas PACE Authority and Keeping Pace in Texas, the advocacy and outreach efforts that y'all have done have spread throughout the state, and it's really impressive to see kind of the array of districts that we see around the state. Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? I saw someone kind of pop up their hand for a question, but then I missed it. So there was someone that wanted to speak. Let me know.
One thing, Cassidy, while you're digging that up, just an observation and something that we'd like to see change and improve on is, most of these early projects have been pretty big projects and multiple measures, pretty sophisticated owners that were already familiar with PACE, and maybe they had projects in other states, and so they said, yeah, this makes sense for us. And then also the capital providers, there are specialty PACE capital providers that understand how it works, and so you typically had that situation with a lot of these early projects, but PACE is designed and for every commercial and industrial property owner in the state. And some of these smaller projects have been missed because maybe there's a lower threshold with some of the PACE equity investors, or some of the smaller owners are too busy running their business and don't have time to look at this. So one of the things we're going to be doing in a very deliberate way over the next 3 to 6 months is to try to streamline the processes so that PACE is more accessible to smaller business owners. And a key part of that is first of all, finding and establishing and engaging a network of engineers to serve as ITPRs throughout the state and in those smaller communities where they don't exist now. And then the other is engaging local lenders that already have a relationship in many cases with these business owners, and PACE for them, could be an additional way they bring value to their community by financing the reinvestment in these facilities. Local lenders have now been involved in 2 projects. Actually, the one in Elgin that we talked about, the rooftop PV, which is great. And then more recently, a project in Waco in McLennan County, actually as a regional lender, but a bank versus like a specialty lender. And we'd like to see more banks and local lenders involved. And we've had trainings and outreach to the lender community already, but we'll, this is still something that we need to work on. But trying to, again, make this more accessible to any eligible property owner anywhere in the state. And it's going to be a sort of a different team or set of partners, for those kind of projects than the ones we've seen already.
Great. Yeah, that's good news. And I see some engineers on the call today, so looking at you guys and ladies. All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much. That is time. Look for a follow-up email from me with my presentation and Dub's. This video will be posted to our YouTube channel as well. Dub, thank you for everything you do, and thank you for joining us today. And everyone have a good rest of your day. Cheers.